Easter, 1916. At noon, Dublin, Ireland explodes in gunfire as a motley band of Irish rebels takes on the world's biggest empire. They begin by hijacking a post office.
Many of the people of Dublin during the Rising viewed it as the expression of a gang of crazy people.
I don't think there was any consensus view among the revolutionaries themselves as to what they hoped to achieve.
Outnumbered and outarmed, the rebels would be crushed by British forces within days. And what was intended to be the opening act of the Irish Revolution became a humiliating failure. But history would tell a different story. The rebels would be honored as heroes. Their actions would inspire thousands to join the revolutionary cause and set Ireland on a rocky road to independence. On May 1st, 1916, a poet named Patrick Pearse wrote a letter to his mother from his cell in a Dublin jail.
We are ready to die, and we shall die cheerfully and proudly. Personally, I do not hope or even desire to live. You must not grieve for all this. We have preserved Ireland's honor and our own.
Pearse would be dead 2 days later. It was a strange ending for a scholar and poet who had once committed his life to peace. In the last week of his life, Pearse had led one of the most destructive revolts in Irish history, the Easter Rising. His ambitious goal? To bring England's 800-year rule over Ireland to an end. Ireland had been colonized by its neighbor England in the late 12th century. Over the years, British occupiers had stripped the Irish of their land, suppressed their Catholic religion, and silenced their native language.
England had not given to the Irish an equal share in the growing riches of Great Britain. The political system in Britain was unresponsive to the vast majority of Irish people who were poor and Catholic and hardly educated or lightly educated, with very few opportunities for any kind of social or economic advancement.
With nothing left to lose, some Irish turned to rebel activity in hopes of taking back their country through force. But not Patrick Pearse, at least not at first. Pearse was a part-time writer and full-time teacher who had opened a school to teach Irish language and literature to children. But Pearse came to realize that Irish culture and traditions could never be restored while the British were still in power.
Pearse said, there's one thing worse than bloodshed, and that's slavery. And he suggested that that's precisely what continued linkage with England meant, was continued bondage of slavery.
Pearse joined a radical rebel group called the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB. The IRB was holding meetings in a Dublin tobacco shop, secretly plotting revolution. The IRB's leader was Thomas Clark, an ex-convict with terrorist ties who'd served 15 years in a London prison for a bombing campaign. Clark had returned to Ireland bent on insurrection.
If you looked at Thomas Clark, you would have thought, geez, that just didn't seem like the most imposing guy in the world. But he did have an eye for talent and figuring out who was susceptible to Republican ideas and who could serve the movement.
Clark needed a leader, someone less controversial than himself, to head up a revolt against England. His unlikely choice? Patrick Pearse.
Pearse was a romantic and an idealist, and it was kind of a dreamy individual until he met Tom Clark. And somehow Clark figured out that this was the guy that he needed to go out and inspire the troops. And Pearse rose to the occasion and became a national figure.
We pledge to Ireland our love, and we pledge to British rule in Ireland our hate. I hold it a Christian thing to hate evil, to hate untruth, to hate oppression, and hating them, to strive to overthrow them. Ireland unfree shall never be at peace.
Pierce seemed to light a fire in people. Somehow his words changed the way that they understood things, that they talked about a new sense of affirmation and identity as an Irish person.
Pearse vowed to free Ireland or die trying. In 1915, he and Clark began to plan for an armed uprising against the British. They would need at least 100,000 troops to seize control of Dublin's main buildings and key positions in the Irish countryside. They'd strike down British forces along their path, inspiring a nationwide revolt, and finally declare independence for the people of Ireland. If only it were that easy. When Pearse and Clark surveyed their comrades, they met the wide eyes of improbable fighters. Many of the men, Pearse included, had never fired a gun in their lives. Among them, Joseph Plunkett, a fellow poet and a literary editor. He wrote poems about God, nature, and love for his fiancée, Grace. Thomas MacDonagh, another poet and professor, who went from teaching Jane Austen to joining the rebel movement. Eamon de Valera, an American-born math teacher with political aspirations, and Pearse's little brother, Willie.
It's been called the Poets' Rebellion, and it is remarkable how many of the leaders of the 1916 Rising were in fact teachers and writers and intellectuals.
If they were going to fight, they would need help. Pearse and his men enlisted a military leader named James Connolly, who had honed his fighting skills while in service to the British Army. Connolly's second-in-command was a bloodthirsty aristocrat named Countess Constance Markievicz.
It's a very unlikely group of revolutionaries, putting it mildly. But Thomas Clark and the young men that he's gathered around him in that tobacco shop begin to organize to lead the country or inspire the country into an insurrection.
We love freedom and desire it. To us, it is more desirable than anything in the world. If you strike us down now, we shall rise again and renew the fight. You cannot conquer Ireland. You cannot extinguish the Irish passion for freedom.
But public support was hard to find. While many Irish liked the idea of independence, a majority was holding out hope for a non-violent solution with England. Few supported an insurrection, and almost none supported the increasingly aggressive strategy offered by Pearse. They had good reason. Britain was the most powerful empire in the world. It had conquered land on nearly every continent and included over 400 million people. Ireland had attempted rebellion before and was bitterly defeated. But in 1916, Pearse saw an opportunity. England was embroiled in the First World War, which had begun 2 years earlier.
I think the old adage, England's difficulty, Ireland's opportunity, captures the whole spirit of what energized the movement. Pearse felt that with the carnage that was taking place on the Western Front at the time, that Britain simply couldn't afford transporting troops to suppress a rebellion in Ireland.
With the World War rapidly depleting England's weapons and troops, Pearse ordered his men to strike soon, while British defenses were down. Clark agreed, and they set a date, Easter Sunday. The rising would begin right in the center of town at the Dublin General Post Office.
The post office is a very large building. It's a very imposing granite structure, et cetera. And it has a kind of symbolic significance on O'Connell Street, which is the main thoroughfare of downtown Dublin. And Pearse was very conscious of the symbolism involved.
But before they could strike, the rebels needed cash and guns, fast. They turned to the United States. Millions of Irish had fled to a better life in America. Many had prospered there, and their families donated thousands of dollars to the rebel cause. But weapons were harder to come by.
There were deep disagreements about how to find arms and to what degree the Irish Republican movement should align itself with the enemies of Britain. This led, of course, to the celebrated case of Roger Casement.
Roger Casement was a British knight who had defected to the rebel cause. Casement turned to the one country he could count on to support a revolt against the British, England's arch enemy in the war, Germany. Casement secretly negotiated with the Germans for a shipment of 20,000 weapons and artillery to aid the Irish rebels. The arms were set to arrive on Ireland's west coast before Easter. But just days before the planned revolt, as Roger Casement was on his way back to Ireland aboard a German submarine, British military authorities broke into German lines of communication and discovered the weapons plot. The British arrested Casement after he landed on Irish shores. No German arms would ever reach the rebels. The British were quickly catching on to the rebel plan. Their wiretaps also revealed that the first target would be the Dublin General Post Office.
British intelligence had parts of the thing understood, but the timing and everything they didn't understand. And really, in many ways, the plan was so bizarre that, you know, if you're a British general, you're sitting there going, well, let's see, they're going to take over a post office. Okay. You know, of all the buildings of downtown Dublin, the post office, why not attack the military barracks?
Back at rebel headquarters, news of Casement's capture, the nearing deadline, and the shortage of guns threw the rebel plan into chaos. And it would get worse. The day before the planned attack, amidst mounting confusion, rumors emerged that the rising was called off.
The rebels decided, well, we're not going to allow it to be canceled, we're going to hold it after all, but they didn't have the communication means to notify the entire country.
With rumors swirling, troops in the Irish countryside believed the rising was canceled. But undeterred, Pearse called his Dublin men to arms. In spite of everything, with only a fraction of their rebel army, they vowed to proceed, just one day behind schedule.
What amongst these individuals creates this sense of urgency? I think that when you've committed yourself to an action in which you're contemplating not only killing people, but dying, that you gotta go. Remember, the purpose of the action is to lead to the ultimate overthrow of Great Britain. Once they've made that commitment, there's like a way that they can't turn back.
At noon on Monday, April 24th, 1916, while most Dubliners were enjoying the annual Ferryhouse horse race, Patrick Pearse and just 1,500 men, carrying crude and outdated arms, set out to end Britain's rule over Ireland.
So they went ahead and had their rising on the Monday in the full expectation that they would catch the British by surprise. They did. They caught themselves by surprise a little bit too, because they very easily captured the General Post Office.
And they run up the tricolored Irish flag, and Pearse steps out of the buildings of the General Post Office with Connolly and Clark and the others behind him, and reads a proclamation of the Declaration of the Irish Republic.
We hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state, and we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, of its welfare, and of its exaltation among the nations.
Pearse's troops spread out to Dublin's other main buildings. They were getting their rebel footing, but were still an unlikely crew. One of the rebels, leading his men to their post, hijacked a local tram. He collected fares from all 54 of his troops and paid the conductor with a thank you and exact change. Meanwhile, the public was trying to figure out what was going on. So were the British. Thinking the rising was called off, many British officers were at the horse race when they heard explosive gunfire. They scrambled to respond. Countess Markievicz, the aristocrat, was stationed at St. Stephen's Green, a Dublin park. Hearing about trench warfare from the front lines of World War I, she and her men dug trenches, a plan whose flaw was quickly learned when British snipers from neighboring buildings rained bullets on the rebel troops.
Military historians can find plenty of examples of ineptitude and of poor planning on both the British and the rebel side during Easter week. What's fairly clear is that however disorganized both sides were at the very beginning of the conflict, by the end of the week, by Thursday and Friday, British military superiority and determination were overwhelming.
British gunships responded in force. From the banks of Dublin's River Liffey, they targeted the city center, bombing rebel positions, occupied buildings, and taking out civilians and power lines in their wake. Dublin was under siege.
Gunboats came up the Liffey and relatively indiscriminately bombed the locations of rebel control. As a consequence, some of the worst pictures of urban destruction in the center of a European capital came from Dublin in 1916.
They were probably outnumbered 8-10 to 1. They were hoping for the best, but they were prepared to die. They absolutely were prepared to die.
By Saturday, the rebels were overpowered.
Pierce actually observes a civilian getting killed. And it dawns on him that, it's not worth doing anymore. They weren't going anywhere. They were trapped.
Just 5 days after they began, Pierce ordered his men to surrender.
By that point, many of the leading figures had been wounded, but also lines of communication had been broken. They were largely surrounded, outgunned, and what Pierce was principally interested in doing at the end of Easter week was in trying to preserve some formal dignity to the events that had happened. His surrender was orchestrated to give dignity to his military army.
When authorities seized Pierce's gun, they found it had not been fired since the rising began.
He spent most of the rising in the General Post Office telling ancient Irish tales and Irish history to the men. I'm sure it was a deep inspiration to them, but it's a very odd activity. We have his gun, and we know it was never fired during the event. He was willing to do the blood sacrifice, but he wasn't willing to kill people, apparently, himself.
For all their talk of fighting and dying for Ireland, Pierce and his men had somehow survived, while the bodies of the wounded and dead lay around them. Thousands were injured. 450 were dead. Dublin was destroyed. The air was polluted with the smell of burning buildings and horses killed in the action. One thing the Irish people and the English could finally agree on was their hatred for the rebels.
Many of the people of Dublin viewed the Rising itself as a disastrous, irresponsible form of military adventurism. And as a consequence, for a while it seemed as in fact that the Rising had done a great deal of harm to the nationalist cause.
The rebels were marched through the streets on their way to Kilmainham jail. Dubliners turned out to protest against them, throwing rotten fruit, spitting at them, and kicking them, while Irish women served tea and cakes to the British troops. An editorial in the Irish Times newspaper called for swift and severe punishment. That's what the rebels would get, and it would change everything. The British began by executing the rebel leaders. In his final hours, Pierce wrote letters to his mother and brother. Pierce was first to be executed, along with Thomas Clark and Thomas McDonough, May 3, 1916. Pierce's little brother Willie would never receive the letter. Though only a foot soldier in the Rising, he would be punished for his family name. He was executed May 4, 1916. Joseph Plunkett married his fiancée Grace in a jailhouse ceremony the night before his execution, also on May 4th. James Connolly, the military leader, had been gravely wounded in the fighting. He had to be strapped to a chair, barely alive, so he could be shot with the proper pomp and circumstance on May 12, 1916.
It was a colossal mistake on Britain's part. They managed to ruin it on themselves by moving ahead and executing 15 of them, and summarily, one day after another. But if they had dumped them into prison, these men would have been objects of contempt and pity.
Instead, they became heroes. The executions were a harsher punishment than the Irish had imagined or wanted. Adding to their shock were the stories coming from Kilmainham jail of the rebels' final hours and bravery in the face of death.
The manner in which they were tried and executed generated a great deal of public outrage at the conduct of British military forces.
Countess Markievicz kissed her revolver before handing it over to British forces. Spared execution because she was a woman, she is said to have remarked, "I do wish your lot had the decency to shoot me."
I think by the time they reached the 15th death, it was beginning to dawn on the British that this was a very counterproductive exercise.
Facing growing public outcry, the British halted the executions. Eamon de Valera, the former math teacher, was spared. He and other rebels were sent to prison.
The interesting thing about their jail experience was that a new generation of Irish Republicans emerged in that jail, and through the study of the Irish language and the playing of Gaelic games, etc., organized the IRB with a new leadership that came right out back into Ireland, ready to go all over again.
Upon his release from jail a year later, de Valera was exalted to hero status. He found that the Irish, once a difficult population to unite, were finally coming together in their resolve for freedom.
One of the things that happened is that the revolutionary and military struggle had begun to be mythologized. This gets back to the central question about the 1916 Rising, is it an event in military history or is it an event in intellectual, cultural history?
Riding a wave of popular support, de Valera helped lead Ireland into a full-scale war of independence against Britain in 1919. The war ended 2 years later with a partial victory for Ireland. Its southern counties won independence, but 6 mostly Protestant counties in Northern Ireland remained under British rule and became home to fierce guerrilla violence for the next several decades. Many of Pierce's original disciples formed the radical Irish Republican Army and fought on behalf of Catholics in the North.
And the sad tragedy of 1916 is that it institutionalized the use of violence, and it made the gun a permanent fixture in Irish politics right down to the present day.
Irish writer Sean O'Fallon wrote about Ireland after 1916.
The Easter Rising was a complete failure, which left large parts of Dublin in ruins. Yet without it, Ireland might never have been free of English rule. The leaders, alive, had very few supporters even among the Irish patriots. Dead, they became and have remained their country's heroes. It was a great historical paradox, and one that to this day the British have perhaps never understood. Had they understood it, it is conceivable that the British might still have an empire.